Hi guys, it's Joey and this is Celtic Calling. This week's goddess is Awinya. It looks like Aine, but it is pronounced Awinya. There are slight variations on the pronunciation before we get started. And second of all, this was a request, so that's why we're having another goddess this week rather than alternating it up to be a god this week. So I'm sorry if I faff with my hair because I trimmed it and it's driving me nuts, and I'm sorry about the light because I appear to be glowing, at least on my version of the camera. So apologies for those two things, and onwards. Okay, so Anya, no, yeah. It's going to be one of those weird days. I can feel it already. Okay, so the goddess Anya is the Irish goddess of love, fertility, cattle and the sun. And I haven't actually worked with her particularly, although reading over some of the information I was thinking maybe it's an energy I might look at in the future for a number of reasons, and we'll talk about that as well. Her worship was centred primarily in the southern province of Munster. Her name means brightness, pleasure or melody. So she is one of the possible alternate faces of the Morrigan in Stephanie Woodfield's book. She's also sometimes considered to be a goddess in her own right. There's a little bit of a argument depending on people's perceptions. There is a line that Anwa is the Morrigan herself from Gregory Gods and Fighting Men, from the famous Irish folklorist Lady Gregory. She's never, however, mentioned as any of the three Morrigans in the early Irish texts. And it is Woodfield's analysis that she is the goddess Anu, the mysterious earth goddess of whom so little is known. It's possible that she was a regional variation of Anu, with a similarity in names, the worship of both being centred in the province of Munster and both being connected to the fertility of land. Knoch Aine, a mound sacred to, oh not Aine, Knoch Amra, sorry. Croch Anya is a mound sacred to Anya, standing only a few miles from the Breastlake Hills that form the Paps of Anu. I love that. Paps of Anu. Yeah, so that's where the connection to the Morrigan is, that it's possible that she is a regional variation of the maiden form of the Morrigan, whom is Anu. So I think we've got that out of the way. I don't think we need to focus on that overly. I think that depends on your experiences and how you wish to interact with the goddess as themselves. There are other bits and pieces which you could consider to be similarities, but then again, the Celtic folklore and things is so affected by the onset of Christianity. So a lot of the Celtic goddesses whom were considered, you know, sexual or too powerful, sort of became fae within the folklore. And this is true of Awinya as well. And there are local legends connecting her to fae myth as well. Because she was a Celtic sun solar deity, Midsummer was sacred to her, and so in traditional style, fires were lit and were carried and waved over fields and livestock to bless them, which is a fairly widespread practice even outside of Celtic mythos. However, according to local legend, this is in Whitfield's book, the procession did not take place one midsummer due to a local man's funeral. That night torches were seen atop Knoch Awinya. I'm gonna have to try and stop doing that. Okay. Awinya. And it was believed to be the fairy folk that instead led the night torches procession, and for this reason she was known as Awinya of the Wisps, referring to the ghostly fairy torchlight seen on the hill. Now, in Woodfield's book, she's given as a solar deity, and we're going to discuss that in a little bit in a minute because I find that whole concept fantastic. In other references, I've seen her referred to instead as a lunar deity, and in some I've seen her referred to as both a solar and a lunar deity. Now, if all this information about the summer solstice and the sacred fires and things, then that to me does suggest being more of a solar aspect. And her sister Grania was another sun goddess and has a similar hill dedicated to her. According to the Dinshencha, Grania was another name for the goddess Macha. If true, it's another connection to the Morrigan. So that's an interesting concept, that it could have been that her sister and her are other faces of the Morrigan. Sorry, the camera went off weird then. And if Awinya was like Anu, and then her sister Granwinya was like Macha, so that's the mate and mother mirror reflections, basically. And before we move on to some of the other bits and pieces that we want to talk about, I want to briefly have a little chat there about the whole idea of a feminine solar deity. First and foremost, I believe Woodfield is writing a book on this, if she hasn't already, and I'm quite excited to see about her feminine solar deities. Because in modern interpretations, at least, that I've ever seen, most attribute masculine energies to the sun and feminine qualities to the moon. And that is quite often how, especially when we work in the abstract, we see things, you know, the sun and the moon, and you know, there are so many references to the sun being masculine, the female being the moon, and that being those energies and being in those very specific roles. And it makes you think about whether or not that is sort of a narrowing of gender roles. And there's been a lot of sort of analysis of gender roles in the YouTube community recently, and I've kind of stayed a little bit away from it because I've studied it a lot in history, in gender history and sociology, which I loved, and gender sort of roles within society. And it is my belief that to completely separate these things is impossible, because everybody is a result of masculine and feminine, and therefore we have masculine and feminine energies in all of us. And to completely dismiss that we are a combination, even from the point of conception, you know, masculine and feminine coming together to create something, then to deny that we are both, in a way, kind of segregates us. It kind of puts us in narrow, stereotypical confines, basically, and these are reinforced as we grow up. You know, girls can play with dolls, and guys can play with, little boys can play with cars and trucks and things. When I was growing up, I loved little cars and things like that, and I don't know that it wasn't particularly discouraged, but it wasn't encouraged either. And there are a lot of examples that people will probably remember from their childhood when they were discouraged from doing something that was too of the opposite gender. You know, it's too girly to do this, or it was too guy-like, manly to do that, you know. I was discouraged from playing football when I was growing up, which I did a lot for a while because it was a boys' sport. There's an example, which is nonsense, of course. But those things get reinforced as we grow up, and even within the spiritual realms. So here is a goddess who is a solar deity, and she is a sort of wilder, free, sexual, lusty goddess of love. Fiery passion, unrepressed sexuality at its rawest level. She took many lovers. I'm trying to see if any of these... There are many, many examples of lovers that she took. I don't know how much it's going to... Well, let's give one example. Another of Anwin's lovers was Gerald, the Earl of Desmond. In one story, he happened upon her when she was washing in a river and instantly fell in love with her. He stole her cloak and refused to return it unless she consented to marry him. In another version, he throws the cloak over her and abducts her. She promised to wed Gerald so long as he vowed never to be surprised by anything their children might do. He agreed, but later broke his promise after their son magically changed his height, shrinking so he could fit into a bottle. With the promise broken, Awinya and their son turned into birds and flew away. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that in that story the guy takes quite an aggressive stance. Kidnapping a goddess. I don't know. Then again, you know, you hear these stories and you wonder how much of them have been changed over the years, and it's a little bit beyond the wall, isn't it? Kidnap your lady, prove that you're worthy, or something. So, bearing this sexuality in mind and her solar role in mind, it's interesting to sort of wonder whether or not the repression of her sexuality and her transformation into a fairy queen, which is something we will go on to in a second, is also connected with the fact that she was a solar feminine deity, and there are quite a few apparently. And so it sort of removes her from her solar goddess role because she becomes a fairy queen and becomes known as a Lianansi, or the fairy lover, because of her habit of taking mortal men to bed. Again, this happens in many goddess tales from Celtic legend, whereby the sexual freedoms of women seems to become repressed with the onset of the Christian monks writing down the tales and literally rewriting them. This happens to Morrigan herself in the role of Morgana Le Fay. And I'm just trying to see if there was any other bits that... In some stories, Awinya is the fairy Awinya, oh goodness, I'm having such problems with his pronunciation. I have no idea why. Is the fairy queen, and in others she is a mortal woman tricked into becoming one of these fairies. Besides being a fairy queen, she's considered one of the Lenansi, a kind of fairy lover who drains men of their life force. Like the Morrigan, her exuberant libido becomes something dangerous and out of the control of the new religion, making to the point where they make her physically dangerous to men. So to the point where they make her physically dangerous to men. And quite a lot of the Fae stories that are centered around the Celtic mythos anyway, the Fae are darker, and there's this warning, there's this dangerousness. And even in the sort of lighter versions where the Fae aren't necessarily vindictively aggressive in these myths, there is always this risk of losing time, of losing yourself, you know, losing your morality, being tempted, all that sort of Christian warning system that comes with the changing, the twisting of the Celtic mythos. And obviously she's completely in her own power. Now here's another example of something interesting. While Awinya is never mentioned with horses in any of the surviving myths, she is called the Leder, or red mare, which would indicate she was also a horse goddess. Since the horse is a solar animal, it's an understandable connection. Also reminiscent of Macha, who is also a horse goddess and a goddess of the sun. So we have solar energy, Fae energy, horse energy, and a wild libido. Also worth mentioning, she's a goddess of healing. She was said to rule over the life spark that flowed through all living things. Now, surgery or any medical treatment involving cutting a patient was banned on the 3 days after the festival of lunar, which were considered sacred to Aine. The belief was that the life spark would escape through any cuts made in the patient during these 2 days, causing their death. Now, if you think about it, that sounds like the twisting of that idea in the Fae idea, that she drained life force from men with her libido. So rather than the idea that the life spark within a human was sacred to her and she was gifted with healing because of that, that becomes she can drain men of their life force through her sexual appetites. She's also a goddess of inspiration, carrying a harp. Swans, her totem animals, are also connected to music and inspiration. She could shapeshift into the bird and sometimes wore a cloak made from swan feathers. Okay. And if you think about it, swans are actually connected to sacred unions they mate for life. So that's interesting. So she's one of these goddesses whom is exuberant, obviously. You know, she's connected to the solar energy, she's connected to the horse energy, she has the inspiration. She is obviously young, fiery, lusty, passionate, has this sexuality. She has this ruling ability over life force, amongst other things. Just quickly, correspondences: red, gold, herbs are meadowsweet and yew. We will talk about that in a second. Stones are garnet and rose quartz. Full moon phase, noon and midsummer phase, horse and totem, swan totem, apologies. She's also connected to the yew, a tree traditionally associated with death, another parallel to the Morrigan. So she is not simply a goddess of love and death. Pause. rewind, start again. She is not simply a goddess of love and pleasure, but also connected to the darker cycles of death and change. Also, she has been identified with the Banshee, a fae most associated with the Morrigan and connected to death. The Wailing Woman is a description of her by a member of the Fitzgerald family in a eulogy, who claimed her as an ancestor. So, okay, so she appears to have a solar connection, and then that would make sense as why she would have a lunar connection as well. Okay, so in Celtic mythos, which I've been reading a lot about, there is a lot of the idea of balance, of light and dark in all things, and I was reading about the idea of twins, which is in my Ogham video. Tenesty, the idea of that's the killer of the king. So go have a look at the Ogham about that. But the idea of having this twin, of this light and dark, of this balance, which makes sense that she might have a lunar aspect as well, I suppose, although not mentioned in a lot of the information that I could glean on. But that is mentioned in a lot of people who have connected with the goddess herself. So she's one of these goddesses who clearly feels quite primal and has this exuberance, this life force, this incredible energy of being in possession of her own will, of her own sexuality, lusty, free, vibrant, alive. And through the myths she then becomes lessened as the onset of Christianity, who wanted their women not to be any of these things, but instead to be well behaved and, I don't know, you know, sexuality was sinful and not to be enjoyed in such an exuberant manner. It was repressive instead. And they become fae, they become, and Awinya becomes a fairy queen, and even less than a fairy queen in some of the myths, a mortal who is sort of taken by the fae. So she becomes mortal in some of the myths rather than her goddess stance. And then, you know, it's sort of draining all the energy out of these myths and these goddesses and taking away from them as a solar goddess. And it makes you wonder and pause whether the modern interpretation of the sun being a masculine energy and only being a masculine energy is something we need to redress, because instead it's narrowing, you know, it's gender stereotypes, it's gender roles. And by looking at things such as the Celtic myths, that we realise that, you know, back then, these qualities of feminine, you could be exuberant, you could be a warrior, you could be all of these things, and it was just within the accepted roles of women. I've made points before where the female warriors were some of the most feared Celtic warriors, and to this day they're some of the most famous. Do you see it? Even now, that is still within conscious memory, societal memory, is interesting. That you know, that these strong female roles cannot be completely suppressed. So it's worth examining that idea of solar feminine energy, absolutely. And it's given me something to pause and think about from learning about that, about how we actually why is the sun, the daytime, the masculine and not feminine? Why has that become that way? Is it just because of the sort of, I don't know, modern imagery through other religious ideals? Is it just that we've become so maybe even indoctrinated by the idea of what roles are masculine and what roles are feminine, rather than embracing the balance of both and allowing masculine to be nurturing and allowing feminine to be more aggressive? I don't know. I think it's a really interesting food for thought though, and it's something I will possibly go away and think about some more. I think we've covered everything we need to. We talked about Fae and how the Christianization of a lot of Celtic myths went into sort of Fae type myths, and that's not to say that sort of energy can't be celebrated if you are connecting with the goddess herself. And the reason why not is because in a way you could see it as her being celebrated, you know, a sort of facet of herself, of being free, of being both, of being other and mystical and fae, you know, the other, something other than mortal, but still embracing her role as goddess. She can be both of those energies. It can play into that exuberance, that freedom, that sensuality. So that's going to be it for this week's Celtic Calling. Many blessings.